An elderly man and his tiny puppy were humiliated at a billionaire's mansion when a rich heiress poured water over him for a cruel laugh. She mocked his silence, believing he had no one to stand for him. But she didn't know his son. Daniel Hale isn't just a man. He's a Navy SEAL, returning home that very night, and he was already walking through the gates. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. Warm Savannah air clung to the mansion like a silk shawl, scented with jasmine and expensive cologne, while strings of amber lights glittered over marble steps as if the house had stolen a piece of sunset and refused to give it back. Frank Hale was 60, an age that still carried strength in the shoulders, but left quiet receipts in the joints. He had the lean, work-worn build of a man who'd spent decades lifting what other people dropped. Trays, boxes, burdens, second chances. His hair was mostly salt, with a stubborn pepper streak above his right temple, and his jaw showed the shadow of a short, practical beard he kept because razors cost money and time. His eyes, a steady hazel, had the teacherly patience of someone who'd learned long ago that anger was expensive. It burned fuel and never warmed the hands. Years earlier, a factory layoff had cracked his pride like old glass, and ever since, he moved through the world with a quiet humility that wasn't weakness, just strategy. Tonight, he wore a borrowed white button-up under a kitchen apron, sleeves rolled to the forearms, knuckles nicked from honest work. In his pocket sat a thin envelope, soft at the corners from being counted too many times. Inside was every spare dollar he'd scraped together doing late shifts and odd kitchen gigs, all for one purpose: a homecoming gift for his son, Daniel Hale, 35, about to be discharged after years in uniform. Daniel was the kind of man who never asked for anything, which made Frank want to give him everything. Tucked near Frank's ankle, half hidden by the bustle of caterers and clattering trays, was a tiny puppy named Pip, barely old enough to know the world's rules and blissfully uninterested in them. Pip was a small, fluffy mutt with a cream and caramel coat and ears that flopped like soft question marks. His paws were too big for his body, as if he'd been built with optimism and an accidental extra scoop of hope. A cheap red collar circled his neck, and his eyes, dark, round, and shining, tracked every scent and sparkle with the seriousness of an explorer mapping a new continent. Pip had arrived in Frank's life the way mercy often does, unplanned, shivering in the rain outside a laundromat, and somehow still wagging. Frank had promised himself the puppy would never be hungry again, even if that meant Frank sometimes was. The caterer had allowed Pip in the back corridors only because Pip was small and quiet, and because the people who owned the mansion rarely looked toward kitchens unless something went wrong. And tonight, everything felt like it could go wrong. The party was for the city's billionaire circle. Polished voices and sharper smiles, champagne flutes held like trophies. The kitchen was a separate kingdom below the glitter, a realm of heat and urgency where chefs moved like generals and the air tasted of butter, garlic, and deadlines. Frank worked the edges, wiping counters, hauling bins, filling ice, doing the invisible labor that made rich people feel effortlessly fed. Each time his hand brushed the envelope in his pocket, he pictured Daniel's face at the end of this long road, older than 35 in the eyes, still good, still steady. Frank didn't know what gift could possibly match the weight of what Daniel had carried, but he wanted to try. A watch, maybe. Something durable, something that could mark time without wasting it. Something that said, "I saw you come back, and I'm proud you did." A sharp clatter snapped Frank out of his thoughts. A server's tray had tilted, and in the small chaos of apologies and reaching hands, Pip spotted his chance. An open door, a slip of music, the beckoning perfume of the grand hall beyond. Pip wriggled from Frank's heel like a lively thought escaping a tired mind and darted through the service doorway. "Pip! No, no, no," Frank hissed, the word barely audible under the kitchen noise. His heart lurched, not because the puppy might embarrass him, though it would, but because in a place like this, small creatures were treated like clutter. He saw in his mind, like a bad prophecy, a booted foot, a shouted order, a security guard grabbing too hard. Frank wiped his hands on his apron and hurried after him, moving faster than his knees liked. The corridor opened into the mansion's main hall, where the world changed in a single step. The air cooled, the floor shone. Music floated from somewhere unseen, a string quartet playing something gentle enough to sound like virtue. Frank's worn shoes looked suddenly louder against the marble, and he instinctively drew his shoulders inward, trying to make himself smaller. He found Pip near a column wrapped in white roses, sniffing at a fallen canapé, with the devotion of a monk discovering a sacred text. "Buddy, come here," Frank whispered, forcing calm into his voice. He crouched, reaching out slowly, one hand open like an offering. Pip's tail wagged, quick, joyous, careless, and the puppy bounced backward, turning the chase into a game. Pip skittered toward the center of the hall, tiny nails clicking, and Frank followed, half crouched, half running, a grown man trying to catch a comet with his bare hands. Heads turned. Conversations slowed. Frank felt eyes land on him. Curious, annoyed, amused. He wanted to disappear into the walls. He wanted to scoop Pip up and retreat to the kitchen where he belonged, where people at least pretended to be human to one another. Frank finally cornered Pip near a fountain that burbled softly under chandelier light. And just as his fingers brushed the puppy's collar, a laugh rang out, bright, sharp, and young, like a knife tapping a crystal glass. A woman stepped forward from a cluster of partygoers as if she had been waiting for the room to offer her entertainment. Vivian Blackwell was in her mid-20s, tall and elegantly slim, with flawless makeup and a smooth, sun-kissed complexion that suggested she spent winters in places where snow existed only as decoration. Her hair, glossy and dark blonde, was pulled into a sleek style that didn't permit a single strand of rebellion. She wore a pale designer dress that hugged her like confidence, and her smile was practiced, beautiful from a distance, cruel up close. The people around her, friends in tailored suits and shimmering gowns, tilted their phones toward Frank as naturally as sunflowers turning to light. Vivian's eyes flicked from Pip to Frank's apron, to Frank's scuffed shoes, and her expression settled into delighted contempt, the way someone might look at a stain and decide it was funny. "Oh my God," Vivian said, loud enough for the nearest circle to hear. "Did the help bring a petting zoo?" Frank's face warmed, then cooled, then warmed again, shame doing its confused little dance. He swallowed, keeping his voice gentle because a gentle voice was often the only shield a working man had. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. He got loose. I'll take him right back." He tightened his hold on the collar, trying not to hurt Pip, trying to protect him from the room's attention. Pip looked up at Frank with innocent faith, trusting him the way the small trust the sky. Vivian didn't step back. She stepped closer. In her hand was a tall glass of water, clear, cold, beaded with condensation, like a necklace of tiny pearls. Her smile widened as if a private god had whispered a prank into her ear. Frank watched her lift the glass, watched the room's anticipation gather like storm clouds under a chandelier. He opened his mouth to speak. Another apology, another plea, yet no sound arrived in time. Pip gave a small, uncertain whine, sensing the shift, his tail slowing mid-wag. Vivian tilted the glass. The first cold drop left the rim, hanging in the air for a heartbeat like a tiny falling star. Then it began its descent toward Frank's hair and face, toward the envelope in his pocket, toward the last thin thread of dignity he'd carried into this palace of lights. The water landed all at once, not gently, not by accident. It struck Frank Hale's hair and face with a sharp, icy slap, soaking through the collar of his borrowed shirt and racing down his spine like a shock meant to remind him where he stood in this world. The glass was empty when it hit the marble, rolling once before coming to rest beside his scuffed shoe, while a thin sheet of water spread outward in a widening, unforgiving circle. For a second, Frank didn't move. His eyes closed on instinct, lashes clumping as droplets slid from them. The cold wasn't what hurt. What hurt was the sound that followed, the sudden burst of laughter, bright and careless, rising like applause at a cruel joke. It echoed beneath the chandeliers, bounced off the stone columns, and settled into Frank's chest with a weight he hadn't felt since the day he was told his job no longer existed, and security walked him out like a stranger. Pip squealed, a small frightened sound that cut through the laughter. The puppy had been splashed too, his soft fur plastered against his tiny frame, paws skidding as he tried to regain footing on the slick marble. Frank reacted instantly. He dropped to one knee, ignoring the ache that flared in his joints, and scooped Pip into his arms. The puppy trembled, pressing his wet nose against Frank's throat, trusting him completely, as if Frank were a wall nothing could pass through. "Oh, relax," Vivian Blackwell said, waving one manicured hand as if shooing smoke. Up close, her beauty was sharp-edged. Her eyes were pale blue and assessing, the kind that learned early how to measure people and discard them. She leaned lightly into one hip, perfectly balanced, as though she'd rehearsed this moment. "It's just water. You look like you needed a rinse." Her friends laughed again. A tall man in a charcoal suit, one of Vivian's regular shadows, tilted his phone for a better angle, his grin wide and empty. Another woman, thin and angular with platinum hair and a dress cut to intimidate, covered her mouth as if amused rather than appalled. Around them, guests paused mid-sip, mid-sentence. Some frowned. Most did nothing. Silence, Frank realized, could be louder than shouting. "I'm sorry," Frank said quietly. His voice was steady, though his heart wasn't. He stood, Pip cradled carefully against his chest, shielding the puppy from the stairs. Water dripped from his sleeves onto the floor, each drop a small, humiliating tick of time. "I didn't mean to interrupt. I'll take him back to the kitchen." Vivian's smile thinned. She didn't like apologies that didn't beg. "The kitchen?" she repeated, tasting the word. "Right. That's where you belong." A man in a dark suit stepped forward then, moving with the brisk confidence of someone used to enforcing rules that benefited him. His name was Lawrence Pike, the event manager, mid-40s, average height, neatly combed brown hair already thinning at the crown. His tie was tight, his posture tighter. Lawrence had learned to survive by pleasing powerful people, and it had shaped him into someone who mistook obedience for professionalism. He glanced at Vivian first, checking her mood, then turned to Frank with an exasperated sigh. "You can't be here," Lawrence said, keeping his voice low but firm, as though addressing a stubborn appliance. "This area is restricted. And animals. Absolutely not." Frank nodded. "I understand. I was just—" "And you've made a mess," Lawrence continued, gesturing to the wet floor as if Frank himself had spilled it. "This is a high-profile event. We can't have distractions." Pip whimpered again, and Frank tightened his hold just enough to reassure him. "I'll clean it," Frank said. "I'll wipe it up and go. Please." Vivian laughed softly, a sound without warmth. "Oh, don't bother," she said. "It's already ruined. Like the mood." She leaned closer, her perfume sharp and floral. "Next time, keep your pets and your problems out of sight." Something shifted inside Frank then. Not anger, exactly, but a deep, weary sadness. He thought of Daniel at 7, skin scraped and eyes bright, insisting he didn't cry when he fell, because soldiers don't cry. Frank had corrected him gently, told him real strength was knowing when to stand and when to kneel. Frank had lived by that. Tonight, he knelt only for Pip. "I'm leaving," Frank said, his tone calm. He didn't look at Vivian again. He turned toward the service corridor, every step deliberate, measured. Behind him the laughter rose once more, louder now, fed by phones and bravado. But the humiliation wasn't finished with him yet. "Wait," Lawrence called out. Frank stopped, heart sinking. Lawrence stepped around him, blocking the path. "You need to exit through the side gate, not through the main corridor." "That corridor leads to the kitchen," Frank replied. "Not anymore," Lawrence said. "You've caused a disturbance. Security will escort you." Two guards approached, both large men in matching black suits. One was older, with gray at his temples and a tired face that suggested he'd once had opinions. The other was younger, broader, his jaw clenched like he enjoyed authority a little too much. The older guard avoided Frank's eyes. Frank felt the cold settle deeper, seeping past clothes and skin into something more private. He shifted Pip higher against his shoulder. "I just need my things," he said. "My jacket's in the back." Lawrence shook his head. "We'll have it sent later." Vivian clapped once softly. "Problem solved," she said. "Honestly, some people." As the guards moved closer, Frank's hand brushed his pocket, feeling the thin envelope there. The edges were damp now. He imagined the bills inside, creased, counted, hoped over. He imagined Daniel opening a gift bought with pride, not pity. The image wavered, then steadied. Frank straightened his shoulders. "Please," he said again, quieter now. "My son is coming home soon. I just wanted—" Vivian rolled her eyes. "Everyone has a story," she said. "Doesn't mean it belongs here." Frank lowered his gaze, not because he agreed, but because he knew when words would only be used against him. The guards reached out then, not roughly, but with the impersonal firmness of policy. Pip whimpered, sensing danger, his small body trembling. And somewhere deep in Frank's pocket, a phone vibrated once. Frank froze. He hadn't felt it ring over the noise, hadn't realized the call had connected earlier when Pip bolted, and he'd answered without looking. The vibration was faint, easily missed. Frank felt it anyway, like a second heartbeat. He didn't reach for it. He didn't dare. On the other end of that silent line, miles away, a man listened. The guards guided Frank toward the side exit, their hands light but unyielding. As they moved, Frank caught sight of the wet marble reflecting the chandeliers, the spill already being wiped away by staff who wouldn't meet his eyes. The laughter faded behind him, replaced by the hum of climate control and the dull thud of his own pulse. Just before the door swung closed, Vivian's voice carried one last time, amused and dismissive. "Next time," she said, "leave the dog at home." The door shut. The music swallowed the hall again, and the phone in Frank's pocket continued its quiet connection, unseen, unheard, except by the one person who mattered most. The night was quiet where Daniel Hale stood, the kind of quiet that pressed against the ears and made small sounds feel enormous. He was 35, broad-shouldered and lean, with the unmistakable posture of a man who had spent years learning how to occupy space without wasting motion. His hair was cut close at the sides, a practical style that left no room for vanity, and a short, neatly kept beard framed a face marked by calm lines rather than softness. Daniel's eyes were a deep gray blue, steady and observant, shaped by long hours of watchfulness and the hard lessons that came with responsibility. He had learned discipline young, first from a father who showed up even when tired, then from a uniform that demanded accountability. Daniel was in a modest rental room near the base, his duffel bag packed and resting against the wall, boots lined beneath a chair. Tomorrow was supposed to be simple: paperwork, signatures, a handshake, a plane ticket home. He had imagined it quietly, without ceremony. After everything he'd seen, quiet felt like a reward. He was standing near the window when his phone vibrated, once faintly, on the table behind him. He hadn't heard it ring. He turned anyway, as if instinct had tugged him back. The screen showed his father's name. Daniel answered without hesitation. "Dad?" There was no reply. Instead, sound poured through the speaker. Music first, distant and elegant, then laughter. Daniel frowned. He adjusted the volume, trying to place it. The acoustics were wrong for a home or a street. Too open, too polished. Then he heard it. A man's voice, sharp with authority, telling someone to move along. A woman laughing, bright and careless. The unmistakable splash of water, followed by laughter louder than before. Daniel's jaw tightened. He leaned closer to the phone, every sense narrowing. "Sir, you need to leave," someone said. "Security will escort you." Daniel's breath slowed, controlled. He didn't speak. He listened. Years of training had taught him that silence was sometimes the most powerful position. Through the layered noise, another sound cut through. A small frightened yelp, high-pitched, brief. Daniel's hand curled into a fist. He knew that sound. His father had sent him pictures, videos, short messages filled with warmth during the past months. Frank smiling shyly behind the camera. A tiny puppy bouncing into frame, ears flopping, tail wagging with reckless joy. Daniel had watched those videos on nights when sleep wouldn't come. That yelp was Pip. "Dad," Daniel said again, low now. "I'm here." But Frank didn't answer. All Daniel heard was movement, muffled footsteps, the scrape of a door. Then a woman's voice again, dismissive, almost bored. "Next time, leave the dog at home." The line stayed open. No goodbye. No explanation. Just the hollow echo of distance. Daniel closed his eyes. He stood very still, letting the noise fade into memory, sorting what. He had heard the way he'd been trained to sort information under pressure. Public space, wealth, humiliation. His father's voice, quiet, apologetic. The power imbalance was unmistakable. Daniel felt something cold settle in his chest. Not rage, but resolve. Rage burned too fast. Resolve endured. He moved with purpose then. Daniel grabbed his jacket and slid his phone into the inside pocket, never breaking the connection. He picked up his duffel, slung it over his shoulder, and stepped into the corridor. The bass was winding down for the evening, lights dimmed, voices low. He passed men and women he'd served with, nodding politely, offering no explanation. There would be time for words later. Outside, the air was cool, a sharp contrast to the heat he imagined back home. Daniel unlocked his car and sat behind the wheel, hand steady as he started the engine. He placed the phone in the center console, speaker still on. The line hadn't disconnected. Somewhere, miles away, his father was still moving, still breathing, still unaware that he wasn't alone. As Daniel drove, memories rose uninvited. His father teaching him how to tie a knot properly, patient hands guiding smaller ones. Frank insisting on eye contact when speaking, not as a demand, but as respect. Frank working 2 jobs after Daniel's mother passed, grief tucked away so thoroughly it almost disappeared. Almost. Those memories didn't make Daniel sentimental. They made him focused. He pulled into a rest stop and parked beneath a flickering light. The phone crackled softly, then picked up new sounds, wind now, and distant traffic. Daniel exhaled. They were outside. His father had been escorted out. The humiliation hadn't ended inside. It had followed him into the night. Daniel checked the screen. The call duration kept climbing. He adjusted his grip on the steering wheel. "Dad," he said, quietly but firmly. "Stay on the line. I'm coming." A passerby walked near Frank on the other end, their voice drifting through the speaker. "You okay, sir?" a woman asked, gentle, concerned. Daniel's heart lifted slightly at the sound of kindness. "Yes," Frank replied, faint but clear enough. "Thank you. I'm fine." Daniel swallowed. His father was still protecting everyone else's comfort. The woman introduced herself, briefly. Marilyn, mid-50s, a catering assistant with kind eyes and a tired voice. She had a practical build and graying brown hair pulled into a loose bun, her hands marked by long hours of work. She didn't ask questions. She simply offered a towel, her tone calm and respectful. Daniel listened as Marilyn helped Frank dry his hair, her voice steady. "They shouldn't have done that," she said quietly. "Some people forget how to be human." Frank murmured something in reply, too soft for Daniel to catch. Pip whimpered once, then settled. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief second, imprinting the moment. Marilyn was a reminder, proof that dignity existed even in the shadows of cruelty. He filed the detail away, not for revenge, but for truth. Truth mattered. The call continued as Frank gathered his things. Daniel heard the rustle of fabric, the faint clink of coins, the slow rhythm of steps moving away from the mansion. He pictured his father's posture, slightly stooped, but unbroken. He pictured Pip tucked against his chest, trusting as ever. Daniel drove. Mile after mile passed beneath the tires. He didn't speed recklessly. He drove the way he did everything else, with control. Along the way, he made a single call of his own, brief and precise, to a man he trusted. Marcus Reed answered on the second ring. Marcus was in his late 40s, tall and solid, with a calm demeanor shaped by years in law enforcement. His hair was dark with silver at the temples, his voice even, unflappable. He and Daniel had met through a veteran support program. Mutual respect had turned into quiet friendship. "Marcus," Daniel said, "I need eyes on a private event in Savannah. Tonight. I'll explain later." Marcus didn't ask why. "Send me what you have." Daniel ended the call and returned his focus to the line with his father. Frank was breathing steadily now, the initial shock wearing off. Daniel listened to every sound, every pause. He wasn't there yet, but he was closer. As the hours slipped by, the night stretched wide and patient around Daniel's car. He felt the weight of impending change settle in, not just the end of his service, but the beginning of something else. This wasn't a mission assigned by command. This was personal. And personal, Daniel knew, demanded clarity more than force. Ahead, city lights began to glow on the horizon. Daniel tightened his grip on the wheel. He didn't know exactly what waited for him, only that the truth had already started its slow, inevitable march. The call was still open. His father was still on the other end of the line, and Daniel was no longer listening as a son who worried. He was listening as a man who was about to act. The mansion had settled back into its polished rhythm by the time Daniel Hale arrived. The earlier disruption smoothed over like a wrinkle pressed flat. Music flowed again, low and elegant, and laughter returned. Careful now, curated. From the circular drive, the house looked serene, a white monument to comfort and certainty, its windows glowing with a warmth that promised belonging only to those who could afford it. Daniel parked beneath a live oak and stepped out, tall and composed, the night air lifting the faint scent of salt and jasmine. He wore a simple dark jacket over a gray shirt, nothing that announced rank or reputation. His beard was trimmed, his hair neat, his posture unmistakable, balanced, ready, unhurried, the kind of man who didn't rush because he had learned what haste cost. He checked his phone. The call was still open. His father's breathing was audible now, steadier than before. Pip's small, contented huffs rose and fell like punctuation marks of trust. Daniel walked toward the entrance. Security noticed him immediately. A younger guard straightened. An older one assessed him with the tired competence of someone who'd learned to read men. Invitation? The younger guard asked. Daniel met his gaze. I'm here for my father, he said, voice calm and low. Not a demand, a statement. The older guard hesitated, something in Daniel's tone disarming, without threatening. Name? Daniel Hale. A pause. Then the older guard nodded once. This way? Inside, the marble gleamed as if nothing had happened. Staff moved efficiently, eyes down. Daniel followed the sound of voices toward the great hall, where the fountain murmured, and the roses still stood pristine, their petals untroubled by human behavior. Vivian Blackwell was there, holding court with a glass of champagne, her pale dress immaculate, her laughter practiced. Lawrence Pike hovered nearby, anxious smile in place, scanning for problems to manage away. Daniel stepped into the open space. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Where is Frank Hale? He asked. The laughter faltered. Vivian turned first, irritation flashing, then curiosity. Who are you? Daniel's eyes flicked briefly to her, then back to Lawrence. I'm Frank Hale's son. Lawrence's smile tightened. Sir, this isn't appropriate. Daniel finished for him, evenly. Neither was pouring water on a 60-year-old man and laughing while he held a frightened puppy. The room went quiet. Phones dipped. Someone coughed. Vivian's smile sharpened. Oh, please, she said. Your father caused a scene. We handled it. Daniel's gaze moved to her now, steady and unblinking. Up close, Vivian saw lines at the corners of his eyes, evidence of nights without sleep, decisions made under pressure. You handled it by humiliating him, Daniel said. That's not handling. That's cruelty. Lawrence stepped forward, palms out. Let's all take a breath. We can talk about this privately. We are talking about it, Daniel replied. Publicly. A new presence entered then, drawing attention by gravity alone. Charles Blackwell, Vivian's father, approached from the far end of the hall. He was in his early 60s, tall, with silver hair combed precisely and a suit that fit like authority. His face was handsome in a polished way, the kind shaped by boardrooms and deference. His eyes, however, were cold, measuring, transactional. He assessed Daniel as he would a variable. What seems to be the issue? Charles asked, voice smooth. Daniel inclined his head slightly. Your daughter poured water on my father. He was working here. He was escorted out. His phone captured it. A flicker of annoyance crossed Charles's face, not at the act, but at the inconvenience. Vivian, he said mildly. She lifted her chin. He shouldn't have been there. Charles turned back to Daniel. I apologize if feelings were hurt, he said. These things can be misunderstood. Daniel felt the cold settle again, precise and clear. There was no misunderstanding, he said. There was a choice. Charles studied him, then smiled thinly. I'm sure we can resolve this, he said, already reaching into his jacket. He produced a checkbook with casual confidence. Your father's distress, the dog's grooming, a replacement phone. Name a number. The hall seemed to lean in. Lawrence exhaled, relieved. Vivian smirked. Daniel didn't look at the checkbook. He stepped closer, not invading space, simply occupying it fully. My father worked tonight to buy me a gift, he said. He doesn't ask for help. He doesn't ask for pity. He doesn't ask for your money. Charles's smile cooled. Everyone has a price. Daniel shook his head once. Not this. He turned then, lifting his voice just enough. Frank, he called. Dad. From the side corridor, Frank appeared, damp hair combed back now, jacket borrowed from a kind co-worker draped over his shoulders. He looked smaller in the vast room, but his eyes lifted when he saw Daniel, relief softening the lines time had etched. Pip peeked from Frank's arms, ears flopping, tail giving a tentative wag. Daniel crossed the floor and stopped in front of his father. He took in the details, the stiffness in Frank's shoulders, the way his hands tightened reflexively around the puppy. Daniel placed a steady hand at Frank's elbow. "I've got you," he said. Frank swallowed. "Danny," he murmured, embarrassed and grateful in equal measure. Daniel turned back to Charles Blackwell. "Keep your check," he said. "What we want is simple. Accountability." Vivian scoffed. "You can't be serious." Daniel met her gaze. "I am." The older guard cleared his throat. "Sir," he said to Charles, "there are cameras." Charles's jaw tightened. He closed the checkbook. "This conversation is over," he said sharply. "No," Daniel replied. "It's just begun." He gestured toward the phones still raised, the staff now watching, the truth no longer confined to shadows. "The footage exists," Daniel said. "So do witnesses." Silence followed, heavy and unavoidable. Daniel guided Frank toward the exit, not hurried, not defiant. As they passed Vivian, Daniel paused. "Next time," he said quietly, "choose kindness. It costs less." They stepped into the night together, the mansion's lights behind them, the path ahead clear. Morning broke gently over Savannah, but the world beneath it was already in motion. By the time Frank Hale finished rinsing his mug and set it upside down on the small counter, the videos had spread faster than any storm. They moved from phone to phone, from whispered links to headlines, from private outrage to public reckoning. The footage was unpolished and undeniable. A young woman laughing as she tipped a glass, a working man shielding a trembling puppy, a room full of wealth choosing silence. There were no clever edits, no angles that softened the truth. The truth needed no help. Frank sat at the small kitchen table, the sunlight catching the gray in his hair, his hands folded as if in quiet prayer. He looked 60 now, in the way mornings sometimes reveal, a man who had lived honestly and paid for it in small aches. Pip lay at his feet, clean and bright-eyed, a soft presence anchoring the room. Daniel stood by the window, phone buzzing intermittently with messages he didn't read right away. He had learned when to wait. He had learned when noise mattered and when it didn't. The public response was swift and unkind to those who had earned it. Vivian Blackwell's name appeared without filters or euphemisms. The comments were blunt. Sponsors issued statements. Invitations vanished. Organizations that once praised her leadership quietly removed her photo from their websites. It wasn't a mob. It was a mirror. And for someone who had lived on reflected admiration, the sight was unbearable. By mid-morning, a black sedan pulled up outside the modest building where Frank was staying. Daniel noticed first. He didn't tense. He simply watched. The car door opened, and Vivian stepped out alone. She looked different in daylight without an audience. The pale designer dress was replaced by a simple navy coat, the lines of her face sharper, unguarded. Vivian Blackwell was in her mid-20s, tall and slim, with carefully styled blonde hair now pulled back without flourish. Her skin, usually flawless under curated lights, showed faint shadows beneath her eyes. The confidence that once wrapped her like armor was gone, replaced by something fragile and unfamiliar. Consequence, Frank realized, aged people quickly. Vivian paused at the door, hesitating as if unused to being the one who waited. Daniel opened it before she knocked. "I'm here to apologize," she said immediately, voice tight, rehearsed but sincere enough to tremble at the edges. She looked past Daniel to Frank. To him. Daniel studied her for a moment. He saw no threat there, only discomfort and the dawning awareness of accountability. He stepped aside. Frank rose slowly, his movements careful, his expression unreadable. "Come in," he said. His voice was neither warm nor cold. It was steady. Vivian entered the small room, her eyes briefly taking in the modest furniture, the chipped mug, the sleeping puppy. The contrast pressed on her. She stopped a few feet from Frank and straightened, as if summoning courage she hadn't needed before. "I was cruel," she said. "I thought it was a joke. I thought—" It didn't matter. Her voice faltered. It mattered. Frank listened without interruption. He noticed how her hands clenched and unclenched, how her gaze kept dropping to the floor, and lifting again. He had seen men older than her break under less honest pressure. "Yes," he said simply. "It mattered." Vivian swallowed. "I can't undo it. I know that. I just—" She looked at Pip, who had woken and now watched her with curious, forgiving eyes. "I'm sorry." Silence filled the room. It wasn't hostile. It was thoughtful. Frank nodded once. "Thank you for saying it," he said. He reached down and rested a hand on Pip's head, grounding himself. "I accept your apology." Vivian looked up, startled. "You do?" Frank met her gaze. "Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened," he said. "It just decides what happens next." Daniel stepped forward then, his presence calm and unyielding. "Understand this," he said, not unkindly. "We're not here to trade forgiveness for silence. The truth already belongs to everyone." Vivian nodded. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking for anything." Outside, the city continued its conversation. Commentators debated privilege and responsibility. People shared the video alongside stories of their own quiet humiliations. It wasn't about the mansion anymore. It was about who people chose to be when they thought no one was watching. Later that day, Frank and Daniel walked with Pip through the same park as before. The path felt different now, not because the world had softened, but because something heavy had been set down. A woman on a bench smiled at Frank and nodded in recognition. A man lifted his hat. None of it embarrassed him. It humbled him. Daniel received a call as they walked. He listened, thanked the caller, and ended it. "Sponsors pulled out," he said quietly. "Boards issued statements. There may be civil consequences." Frank considered that, then shook his head. "That's for them to face," he said. "Not us." As evening fell, father and son sat together on the steps, Pip between them, the sky painted in gold and blue. Frank thought of the envelope still in his pocket, untouched. He thought of the gift he had tried to buy and the one he had given instead. He understood now what the morning had made clear. Courts could issue rulings. Media could pass judgment. But the most lasting verdict was the one people carried home with them, the knowledge of who they had been when tested. Vivian would live with that knowledge. So would everyone who had laughed or looked away. Frank rested his arm against Daniel's, feeling the quiet strength there. He smiled, small and certain. The court of conscience had convened, and no one left unchanged. Sometimes the greatest miracles are not written in the sky, but whispered into human hearts. God does not always arrive with thunder or fire. Sometimes he comes quietly, through truth that cannot be buried, through courage that refuses to be bought, through forgiveness that breaks chains no court ever could. In a world that teaches us power comes from money and status, this story reminds us that dignity comes from character, and justice begins in conscience. Every day, we are tested in small moments: how we treat the weak, how we speak when no one is watching, how we respond when kindness costs us something. May God bless you with eyes that see truth, a heart strong enough to forgive, and the courage to stand when silence is easier. If this story moved you, please share it so others may find hope. Leave a comment with your thoughts or a prayer. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith, justice, and humanity. May God protect you and your loved ones, guide your steps, and remind you, you are never unseen.